is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The United Nations considers a resolution condemning Russia's aggression in Ukraine and urging a peace deal. We're live in New York.
Russia condemns that move by the United Nations after announcing plans to strengthen its nuclear weapons capability.
We report from the front line, where the last few weeks have seen fierce fighting around a small mining town as Ukraine tries to stop Russia's advance.
And Israel carries out airstrikes in the Gaza Strip after Palestinian militants fire rockets at southern Israel. Members of the United Nations are meeting about now to vote on a resolution calling for Russia to withdraw all of its military forces from Ukrainian territory.
The resolution, which is non-binding, also calls on all sides to work towards a long-term peace deal. The emergency session of the General Assembly in New York comes just ahead of the first anniversary of the conflict. Well, as we look at those live pictures from inside the UN, let's talk to our correspondent John Terrett, who's outside that building in New York. So, John, what's happening?
Yes, Jamie and Robbie, welcome to New York. It's a bitterly cold morning here for this meeting, the second day of it. I've just got some direct quotes from people who've spoken in the last hour, and many of them are European ambassadors. France, absolutely determined to support Ukraine. Slovakia, a noble mission is falling apart, referring to the UN. Croatia, this has implications for the UN itself. Poland, which is the main supporting gateway for Ukraine, of course. They said that just now. Poland, a comprehensive, just and lasting peace is the only thing acceptable. And Japan, whose ambassador has just sat down in the last couple of minutes, saying that the UN is being tested by all this and it has been damaged. Robin and Jamie, the meeting began yesterday, Wednesday. It'll continue until this afternoon here. I'm hearing, don't quote me, but I'm hearing that the vote will come at about 20 hours GMT today. It's about 3 p.m. local time. It may be earlier than that. The Secretary General on Wednesday said that the special operation of Russia in Ukraine was an affront to our collective conscience. There will be a vote, as I say, at about 20 hours GMT, if that is accurate. The basic title is Seeking a Just, Lasting Peace. 60 countries have sponsored it. It calls immediately, completely and unconditionally for a withdrawal by Russia from Ukraine. It is, as you said, a non-binding vote, but it will be symbolic because it will be heavily against Russia. There's no doubt about that. Behind the scenes, plenty of diplomatic activity going on. You've seen China's leading foreign diplomat, Wang Yi, in Moscow within the last 48 hours. And Russia is, among the things that they were talking about when he was in Moscow, is the publication in the next couple of days of a positioning paper by Beijing. Now, they won't call it a peace plan. They're calling it a positioning paper, and it will come out in the next couple of days. And this is one of the things that was referred to by Dmytro Kuleba, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Ukraine, who within the past 24 hours has said that he's willing to listen to all ideas to try and get this situation resolved. Take a listen.
So I need to see the full paper. I need to examine it. For Ukraine has its own plan, and it is supported by many countries, which is the peace formula by President Zelensky. 10 simple steps to restore peace in Ukraine and restore just peace. This will remain our top priority. But we are ready to talk with those who have ideas, other ideas, which can help us achieve this goal.
So, John, will this resolution make any difference?
Well, Well, Robin and Jamie, it rather depends on your point of view. On the one hand, absolutely no difference whatsoever, because as you said in the intro, this is a non-binding vote coming up in the General Assembly. All the legal stuff happens in the Security Council, so this is a membership vote. It's non-binding. Russia doesn't have to pay any attention to it whatsoever. It doesn't want to, and I don't think it will either. And we know this because Vitaly Nebenzia, who is the Russian ambassador to the United Nations, has said within the last 24 hours that the vote will make no difference whatsoever. He said it ignores Russia's concerns about military infrastructure of NATO getting closer to Russia's borders. And he urged member nations, all 193 of them, to vote against today's resolution, saying it would make it difficult in the future for countries that vote in favour of it to do business with Moscow. Now, the diplomats here at the United Nations say that this one-year anniversary needs to be marked in some way, and that therefore a vote along these lines in the General Assembly is the best way of doing that. What will be interesting is the breakdown of the votes. Now, we've had 2 of these in the past year in 2022, since the special operation in Ukraine began. You remember when the General Assembly ousted Russia from the Human Rights Council, which is Geneva-based. And then in the fall or the autumn of 2022, there was a very similar vote. The voting then was 143 in favour, 5 against, 35 abstentions, and 10 countries stayed away. What will be interesting today is what India does. Ukraine has been courting India, asking them to vote in favour and not abstain. It'll be interesting to see what South Africa does. South Africa is a member of BRICS, along with Russia and China, and is presently hosting naval exercises with Russia and China. And also in Africa, countries like Mali and Chad. How will they vote, given their association with the Russian mercenary group operating in Ukraine? Jamie and Robin?
John, thank you very much. Our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
Well, Moscow has urged United Nations member countries to vote against this resolution, calling it unbalanced and anti-Russian. President Putin, who earlier laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier as part of national holiday celebrations, announced plans to strengthen Russia's nuclear weapons capability. Let's talk to our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow. Stuart, how is Moscow reacting to this United Nations vote?
Well, first of all, it's saying that the outcome should be taken with a grain of salt, because it says that global nations in the global south are under Western pressure to vote in terms of the way that the proponents of this vote would like. It also says that there's difficulty knowing what to take from this vote, because it's been watered down so much in order to have as many people vote for it as possible. Regardless, Russia says that it can be considered an anti-Russia document, and therefore is not something it, of course, supports. But on top of that, Russia says this distracts from what it would like to see, which it claims is negotiations and meaningful suggestions as to how to create a lasting peace. So, for example, it says there's no mention of dialogue or negotiations in the document, which it says would be the only way to come to any kind of resolution. And finally, diplomats at the United Nations say that they want to talk about other areas of the way that the US has conducted its foreign policy in terms of energy shortages and food shortages, which it's laying the foot of at Western nations that have imposed sanctions on Russia. So that's what Russia thinks of the bill, and also what the United Nations should be focusing on. But indeed, it isn't going to look at this as anything more than a symbolic vote. It's not going to conduct any action based on this, but it is important for Russia to be seen as a country that is supported by nations around the world. So it will come as a little bit of a blow if the majority of nations do not vote in if the majority of nations do vote in favour, including, especially if there are any countries that previously suggested they were aligning themselves with Russia when it came to the special military operation.
What more has President Putin been saying about his plans for Ukraine?
Well, this is a really important day for the Russian military. It's called Defender of the Fatherland Day, and so he's been congratulating soldiers on their efforts so far and thanking them for the sacrifices they've been making in Ukraine. He compared it to the Great Patriotic War, as World War II is known here in Russia, and compared their fight and and their sacrifice to that was made back then. He also promised a host of new advanced weapon systems for Russian forces, suggesting that there would be all sorts of new artillery, drones and reconnaissance and communications equipment for them to look forward to, as well as reminding Russia and the world that it has plenty of nuclear weapon systems, modern advanced nuclear weapon systems, should those be required. Having said that, all of them have experienced delays in coming to development, including the Sarmat missile system, which was meant to be deployed last year, but is still not yet on the front lines.
Stuart, thank you for that. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
Ukraine is hoping that the vote at the United Nations could give it decisive backing in its fight against Russia. Kyiv says its forces are continuing to repel attacks by Moscow-backed troops along the front line in Donbass ahead of the first anniversary of the conflict. Meanwhile, the Spanish Prime Minister is in Ukraine for talks with President Zelensky. Pedro Sanchez has been visiting the towns of Bucha and Irpin, where hundreds of civilians were massacred in the first weeks of the fighting. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Will Denslow, who's in Kyiv. Will, Ukraine reportedly lobbying hard for support from UN members for this vote. What's Kyiv hoping for?
Well, Robin, we've heard from Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's foreign minister, who says that this vote is coming at a decisive moment. He says that the lines between good and evil have never been more clear. Of course, this is a non-binding resolution at the United Nations, so it lacks the teeth of, say, a resolution at the UN Security Council, but of course it is incredibly symbolic, and it's also an opportunity for members of the international community to say categorically whether they're in favour of this resolution that supports Ukraine's territorial integrity and calls for Russian forces to leave the country, whether they're against the resolution or whether they want to continue to sit on the fence and abstain. So it's incredibly interesting to see just how many countries back this proposal. Kyiv, of course, already knows that 60 pen holders have signed on to the resolution. They'll be hoping for many more to vote in favour of it. It'll also be an opportunity to see just how isolated Moscow is in the international community. That is why Kyiv has been lobbying nations like India in recent days to try and garner their support. And interestingly, Robin, just some updates from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky on those talks of a Chinese-backed peace plan. He says that he believes that the fact that Beijing is proposing it is promising. He says that he won't comment on whether he'll support it until he's seen the full text.
And Will, another European leader in Kyiv today, Pedro Sanchez, what's he been saying?
Well, Robin, we know that on social media, Pedro Sanchez, as he arrived into Ukraine, said that he stands in solidarity with the Ukrainian people. And this, of course, comes as Spain's defence ministry has announced that 6 Leopard tanks would be coming Ukraine's way. Of course, these tanks have been so coveted by those here in Kyiv. We've had an update on that. According to Pedro Sanchez, he says that it'll be at least 10 Leopard tanks that'll be making this way. And Pedro Sanchez says more military aid will be on its way in the future too. Let's have a listen.
We have already sent all kinds of ammunition, vehicles and weapons, but we understand that more is needed in order to contain Russia and recover the occupied territory. That is why my country will take its military contributions one step further.
And President Zelensky, for his part, says he thanked Spain for its cooperation, hopes this is just the start and just the sign of things to come, and hopes the two nations can work towards more military aid being sent in the future.
Well, thank you very much. Our correspondent Will Denslow in Kyiv.
Well, far from the intense diplomacy taking place at the United Nations, the war grinds on. During the past few weeks, there's been ferocious fighting in and around the small mining town of Vuhledar.
Like the city of Bakhmut further north, the Ukrainian army is trying to stop a Russian advance. Our correspondent Yolo Apdavid reports.
There isn't much left in Bohoyavlenka. A year ago, 1,500 people lived and worked here. Most have fled after airstrikes and artillery shelling.
We were first bombed by airplanes on the 1st of March last year. Now it's a year since that bombing. Buildings here have been damaged. One woman died and people have left since last March.
Among the ruins there isn't much hope. There are few jobs near a battleground. At least some aid has arrived, and a new resident after the war started. Driven by his faith to offer comfort to those in need, he's afraid of another artillery barrage.
The Russian artillery, instead of just shooting at enemy tanks and personnel, they've actually been targeting Ukrainian artillery. That's something that is basically new. It may have happened very rarely, but now it's pretty consistent. And so it's scarier to sit here and to see that going back and forth over your head.
Ukrainian armor is constantly on the move, repositioning themselves near different villages to avoid incoming fire as much as possible. Most of the heaviest equipment we see has been manufactured in the former USSR. The crew of this Soviet-era T-64 tank is resting, while mechanics see to repairs. The tank commander is 22 years old, his gunner a year younger. They've been battling near Vuhledar's coal mines for a couple of months.
Vuhledar is holding on. By not losing Marinka, it won't be the same situation as in Bakhmut. There they are attacking from 3 sides, but they aren't breaking through. In Vuhledar it's not as bad as it seems. The Russians want to take the town, but they can't, because we have lots of minefields and we fight them with lots of tanks.
Outside the village, 4 old Soviet infantry vehicles are parked up and rearming.
These troop carriers will return to the front line with these men as soon as they've been serviced and repaired. And the men, of course, have been fed, rested and resupplied.
On the opposite side of the road, a reminder how fighting inflicts casualties and grief for another family. This damaged armoured vehicle is being loaded onto a transporter.
They got carried away and drove over a landmine. Unfortunately, the driver didn't survive. But the crew has defended our country very well, and the driver is a credit to our brigade. He has definitely distinguished himself.
Another grave will be opened in Ukraine. More soldiers giving the ultimate sacrifice. Yoloap David, CGTN, near Vuhledar, Ukraine.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, London's Heathrow Airport says passenger numbers grew faster than any other airport in the world last year, but there's still turbulence ahead.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans, grey rhinos, and unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Just a reminder that CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
London's Heathrow Airport says passenger numbers grew faster than any other airport in the world last year, but it still faces operational challenges. The UK's busiest hub says the number of passengers trebled in 2022 after COVID restrictions were lifted. Over 61 million passengers passed through the airport last year, compared with 19 million in 2021. But that number is still 25% down on the pre-pandemic year of 2019. Well, the airport's pre-tax annual losses also halved to around $825 million in 2022. That's down from over $1.5 billion the year before. But as Heathrow shows signs of recovery from its pandemic troubles, there are further challenges ahead. Over 3,000 workers are voting whether to strike, with potential walkouts over the busy Easter holiday. Well, let's talk to Sally Gethin, an independent aviation expert. Sally, welcome. Heathrow says its passenger numbers have trebled. It's made record profits. Has the pandemic gone forever and the aviation industry recovered?
The industry is recovering, but it's still short of the levels in 2019. And the prediction is for global recovery back to that time will come in 2024 and possibly in 2025, depending on the region of the world. So North America and Europe are leading the recovery, including the UK, with Asia Pacific lagging. That's because, of course, of the way the pandemic was handled and the way the shutdowns affected the traffic levels. So Asia Pacific was a bit slower to come out of the pandemic, but the UK was first to exit, followed by Europe. So, but generally, everything's going in a positive direction. And despite all the global problems and challenges, for example, geopolitical instability, for example, and some economic downturns, it's still on a growth path in the long run.
Let's just drill down closely into Heathrow, because it has this self-imposed cap on passenger numbers during the peak summer holidays, but it still grew more than any other airport in the world, it claims. How come? How did they do that?
Well, in fact, the CEO, John Holland-Kaye, said recently that last year was the most painful year of our lives, he said, at Heathrow. So it was the ultimate challenge, because they had to ramp up from zero, basically, when all restrictions were lifted. And they basically weren't ready for that. They had no revenues coming in particularly. So, and they lost a lot of staff. There were no compulsory redundancies, but they lost a lot of staff nevertheless. And they recruited about 25,000 people in the last 18 months to try and compensate for that. So they've been on the back foot, but they had to impose that flight cap, as you mentioned, because there was a surge in pent-up travel, sometimes in pent-up demand, sometimes called revenge travel, as people wanted to get out of the country after being in restrictions on and off for so long. So it was managing that, finding that balance that Heathrow had to deal with. So that accounts for this huge surge in passenger numbers, but also the drop in revenues, because it was carrying huge losses anyway from the shutdowns the previous year. And so it has had to ramp up very quickly, but not had the revenues coming in quite the same way as they were so frozen for a number of years beforehand. Before they rush out to open the duty-free champagne at Heathrow, I mean, it's worth pointing out that it's not all good news, is it? I mean, they still made this pre-tax loss of, what was it, £684 million. I mean, that's not so great, is it? No, and like I said, that has been the hit that they've had to take. I mean, their operating costs have been higher, higher employment costs due to ramping up the recruitment, as I said, the higher rate of inflation, for example, and also they have a lot of capital expenditure coming up. They have a baggage system in Terminal 2, which is 40 or 50 years old. That has to be completely replaced. That's a big expense. And also the airport's planning to make an announcement regarding a potential third runway later this year. They also have some changes in the management structure, in the management there, because the CEO is standing down after a long, successful tenure, actually, as CEO. So there are some changes afoot that they have to navigate. and all this increasing costs, operational and also expenditure coming online too.
Sally, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming on the programme. Sally Gethin, the independent aviation expert.
Well, staying with aviation, and Australia's flagship airline Qantas has posted a record $1.4 billion half-year profit. Chief Executive Alan Joyce described it as a huge turnaround after 3 turbulent years during the pandemic. He also defended ticket prices, which are still 20% above 2021 levels, but said the profit means Qantas can add more capacity and start to reduce fares.
Regional rival Air New Zealand has also made a half-year profit for the first time in 3 years. The airline said a net profit of $185 million was the result of strong travel demand after the reopening of domestic and international borders and strong cargo revenues, which were above pre-COVID levels.
Japanese car makers Honda and Toyota have announced the biggest pay rises for workers in decades. The auto giants are the latest firms in Japan to increase wages as prices surge. Official figures published last month showed inflation was at its highest level in more than 40 years.
Shares in Rolls-Royce have jumped more than 20% after the aviation manufacturer's annual results beat expectations. The British engineering company, which makes the engines for Airbus A350 and Boeing 787 planes, posted an operating profit of $786 million for 2022. That was up 57% on the previous year.
Since the start of the war in Ukraine, the global oil map has been transformed. While Western sanctions and price caps are in place to limit Russia's earnings, its crude oil continues to flow. It may even be finding its way back to the United States and Europe after being refined in India. CGTN correspondent Radhika Bajaj reports on how India is expanding its market.
When Russia's military action started in February 2022, India was not a customer of even a single tanker of Russian crude oil. Exactly a year later, Russia is India's largest supplier, at roughly 1.8 million barrels a day. With deep discounts and attractive payment terms on offer, India has mitigated soaring inflation at home and curtailed its imports bill by increasing its supply from Russia.
Be it Russia or be it the US stand against Russia or Europe stand in the against Russia, are all being dictated by their own commercial interests. So we are saying that we will let our own commercial interests guide us in how we react to this crisis.
India is now playing a key role by refining Russian crude and helping avoid a global supply shock. While the bulk is for home use, there's a keen eye on the export market. In either case, these are golden days for Indian refineries.
Analysts say that there is a minimum margin of about $20 per barrel for refiners in India. The more complex the refinery, the more difficult crudes it handles, the margin goes up, and that can range anywhere between $30 to $40 a barrel.
Data intelligence firm Kepler says India shipped out 89,000 barrels a day of gasoline and diesel to New York in January, the most in nearly 4 years. Daily low-sulfur diesel flows to Europe were at 172,000 barrels in January, the most since October 2021.
I would say that the product price cap, which came into effect on the 5th February, might increase the positioning of India even more because India might suddenly export ultra-low sulfur diesel, so diesel and gas oil, into Europe, produced from Russian oil. Suddenly India, which was always very much focused on Asia as its core market, has grown to have a much wider exposure, a much wider influence on the market.
Analysts say high export duties on diesel in India are preventing Russia from sending over its surplus diesel, which could then be transshipped to Europe at higher premiums. However, India's increase in exports of both diesel and other petroleum products will depend on its domestic demand. Its own production of crude oil caters to only 13% of that. Imports of Russian crude are likely to continue breaking records, in turn breaking barriers to India becoming a supplier of refined products much beyond Asia. Radhika Bajaj, CGTN, Mumbai.
The European Union has been one of Ukraine's biggest supporters, sending more than $60 billion in aid to Kyiv since the start of this war. But the conflict has also forced the EU to make some drastic changes to the way it works, as CGTN's correspondent Alex Cadier reports.
This was the moment that changed the course of peace in Europe. Russian tanks rolling across the border into Ukraine's territory in what Moscow called a special military operation. Kyiv and its Western allies called it a full-scale invasion. In a matter of days, the EU had passed sanctions against Russia and sent millions of dollars of support to Ukraine. The consequences of Russia's attack sent shockwaves into the very foundations of the European Union and forced it to make some fundamental changes fast. Until the conflict, the European Union had never provided lethal weaponry to a non-member state. A year in, the bloc has provided over $3 billion worth of military aid to Kyiv. But Europe had another problem: its reliance on Russian fossil fuels. Until February 2022, the EU got 40% of its gas and nearly 30% of its oil from Russia. Losing that supply meant energy prices skyrocketed, reaching record highs in the summer and hitting European households and businesses hard. Now, the European Commission says the bloc has weaned itself off Russian fossil fuels and prices have plummeted.
We have also shown that we can face off the Russian blackmail with regards to energy. Remember where we were 1 year ago in relation to our dependence on Russian fossil fuels. Almost 1 year later, we have also managed not only to compensate and to ensure our security of supply, but to help bring prices down.
The EU has also looked to its eastern borders and started the process of adding new members to the Union.
I want to know the people of the Western Balkans, Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, to know, and I think I speak in the name of this noble house, you are part of our family, you are the future of our Union and in our Union, and our Union is not complete without you.
Despite political will from the EU, the road to accession will be a challenging one, with some member states urging Brussels to tone down promises of membership, as the process could take a decade. The EU also activated emergency mechanisms to allow refugees from Ukraine to live and work in member states. 8 million of them have since fled the horrors of war to seek refuge in Europe.
Russia's attack on Ukraine was a stress test the likes of which the EU has never seen. There were discussions, debates and even tensions within the bloc. But officials here in Brussels are clear about two things. They say their support for Ukraine is unwavering and that the European Union is stronger and more united than ever. Alex Cadier, CGTN, Brussels.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, we'll have the latest on the coal mine rescue mission in China, where 48 people are still missing.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean? when we talk about the difference.
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. The United Nations considers a resolution condemning Russia's aggression in Ukraine and urging a peace deal ahead of the first anniversary of the war. And Russia condemns the move by the United Nations after announcing plans to strengthen its nuclear weapons capability.
A year of political and economic turmoil, a year of grinding war for the people of Ukraine, a year of key moments on the battlefield of Europe's biggest conflict since World War II. 1 year ago, Russian troops crossed the border after months of military build-up. They quickly reached the outskirts of Kyiv, but met strong resistance, with President Volodymyr Zelensky recording a defiant message from the capital. Within 2 weeks, Russia took control of Kherson and large areas of Zaporizhia, including Europe's biggest nuclear plant. But they got stuck near Kyiv and had to withdraw, switching resources to the east of the country. That withdrawal revealed the first evidence of atrocities, hundreds of bodies of civilians in the town of Bucha, prompting calls for war crimes prosecutions. Days later, Ukraine sank the Moskva missile cruiser, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. In May, the last Ukrainian soldiers at a vast steel complex in Mariupol surrendered after a 3-month siege. The fall of the city cut Ukraine off from its Azov Sea coast, securing Russia's land corridor to the Crimea. September marked 6 months of the war. Ukraine launched a counter-offensive, taking back large areas in the northeast. Russia called up hundreds of thousands of reservists. After the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions and referendums dismissed by Kyiv and Western countries as a sham, President Putin declared Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson and Zaporizhia part of the Russian Federation. In October, a sea bridge linking the Crimea with Russia's mainland was partially destroyed in a huge explosion. Russia responded with waves of missile strikes across Ukraine, hitting power plants and other key infrastructure. November brought a victory for Ukraine, with Russia abandoning the only regional centre it had captured, the city of Kherson. Kyiv accused Moscow of destroying all critical infrastructure during the withdrawal. As winter set in, the conflict became deadlocked. Trench warfare in the east and no major gains made on either side. Russia has continued to launch missile strikes on infrastructure across Ukraine, causing huge power blackouts. Well, Mark Hansian is a retired US Marine colonel and senior advisor at Washington's Center for Strategic and International Studies. He told me there have been 4 key moments in the conflict so far.
The first one was when Zelensky refused evacuation from Kyiv. If he had left, Ukrainian resistance might have collapsed. He stayed and energized resistance. The next key moment was when the Russians pulled back. They gave up the attacks on Kyiv. They pulled back to their borders. They gave up on Kharkiv also and focused on the Donbass. That indicated that the initiative was shifting. Third thing was the massive amount of aid coming from the West and the sanctions far beyond what we've seen in the past. That surprised the Russians. And the final thing was the counterattacks that Ukraine launched in September and October that showed that the balance of power, the initiative had shifted to Ukraine.
So what do you think we will see next? Will the next phase of this war be any different from what we've seen so far?
The next phase is going to be dominated by the offensives that both Russia and Ukraine are planning. We've had about 4 or 5 months of stalemate. Looks like World War I with the trench lines and artillery barrages. The Russians have begun their attacks. This may be their offensive in the Donbass, trying to recapture some territory there. The Ukrainians are building for their own offensive that is expected maybe later in the spring when they have received much of this aid from the West, and also that their troops have received training that they're receiving from NATO countries. That phase is going to be important because it will tell us what the long term of the war might look like, whether Ukraine can be successful in recapturing territory.
And you said that one of the key points was aid coming from the West. There's more to come, isn't there? How pivotal might that be?
Well, the aid has been absolutely critical. Without the military aid from the West, Ukrainian resistance would have collapsed in 2 or 3 weeks. Armies in conflict require a continuous flow of weapons and munitions and supplies. The United States, NATO, and other countries have provided that. It's absolutely critical that that continue at the high level we've seen. It's important to note also that there's no silver bullet. Some weapons have been quite helpful. HIMARS, for example, tanks are going to Ukraine, but there's no single weapon that's going to win the war. What will win the war is a steady flow of weapons and equipment combined with training for the Ukrainians and the determination of the Ukrainian people.
And support has been offered for as long as it takes. We've had President Biden suggesting he will stand by Ukraine as long as he's in the White House. Elections looming in the United States, of course. So do you see that happening?
Well, certainly for the near term, I think that will. Congress voted $45 billion in December. That will run through mid-July, so the administration will not have to ask for more money. And there still is a very strong bipartisan consensus for supporting Ukraine. Senator McConnell was in Germany 2 weeks ago making that point that Republicans were also behind this aid. There is growing opposition on both the left and the right, the progressive left, the populist right. So far, they have not had the numbers to change the basic American policy.
As Nigerians prepare to vote in this weekend's presidential elections, the country is grappling with soaring food prices. Food insecurity has been caused by severe flooding, which has drowned farmland, and the war in Ukraine, disrupting wheat imports. CGTN's correspondent Deji Badamosi reports.
Nigeria's 2022 flooding is among the worst the country has ever recorded. By the time the water began to recede, over 600,000 hectares of farmlands had been damaged, according to Nigeria National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA. Worst hit were the food belt regions of the country. Farmers like Boyomoso Eli in Nigeria's northeast lost everything.
It's a disaster. Really, it's a disaster because all my effort is on my farm. So it's been gone. So I left with no option than to depend on God, than to wait to see what God will do again.
Even before the flooding hit, Nigeria had been facing a huge food security challenge as a result of insurgency and banditry in the country's northeast, northwest, and part of the north-central regions, all of them important food belts. UNICEF estimates that around 25 million Nigerians could be facing food insecurity by June this year, up from the current estimates of 17 million. Food inflation in the country is currently at a high of 24.32%.
The estimate now is about close to 100 million Nigerians who drop into poverty as a result of the high food inflation.
Nigeria imports a large amount of the food it consumes, and one of the major food imports is wheat. The country produces only around 1% of the roughly 6 million tons of wheat it consumes annually, relying on importation to bridge the gap, which the central bank says costs around $2 billion annually. With Russia and Ukraine accounting for the bulk of its wheat import, the conflict between both countries has caused serious disruption in the supply chain, leading to an uptick in the price of staples like bread and cereals in Nigeria.
At some point in the history of our country, we had considered a viable alternative in cassava flour. And that really has not been taken seriously. No significant effort has gone into, improving and incorporating cassava flour into bakery. It is amazing that in spite of what is happening in Ukraine, the supply of bread is still there, but the price is something else.
For now, Nigeria has turned to other alternative markets to make up for the shortfall in the supply of wheat from the Russia-Ukraine regions. The alternatives, though, are quite more expensive. The government is also investing more to boost local production of wheat. For the foreseeable future, though, the country's reliance on import does not look like it's going to slow down. Deji Badamosi, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Rescue work is continuing after 5 people were killed and dozens are still missing after a mine collapsed in China's Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region.
China's President Xi Jinping has ordered a major search and rescue operation. Our correspondent Wang Chiwei reports.
This is the image from a surveillance camera when the coal mine accident happened. According to a worker from the mine, the length of the collapse is about 400 meters. Workers and vehicles are buried underneath. An injured worker recalls the shocking moment.
When we started working at 1:15 in the afternoon, we found small pieces of broken stones rolling down the mountain. When we noticed the situation becoming more severe, we started to evacuate, but it was too late. The mountain just collapsed.
Rescuers rushed to the scene immediately after the accident, but the landslide happened about 5 hours after the accident, causing disruptions for rescue efforts at the site. Chinese President Xi Jinping has demanded an all-out effort in search and rescue operations. Premier Li Keqiang also demanded a quick investigation into the cause of the collapse.
By 11 a.m. today, we have mobilized 156 vehicles, 19 evacuation teams with 919 staff members and 19 experts to the scene. Currently, we're rolling out the evacuation work in an orderly manner.
Inner Mongolia is one of China's major coal-producing regions. The country saw fewer coal mining accidents and casualties in 2022. An investigation has been launched to look into the cause of this accident. Wang Qiwei, CGTN.
There's been an escalation of violence on the Israel-Gaza border, and mediation efforts are underway, brokered by the United Nations and Egypt. Israel's military launched airstrikes on the Gaza Strip hours after Palestinian militants fired rockets towards southern Israel. The cross-border attacks followed an Israeli raid in the occupied West Bank, which left 11 Palestinians dead and more than 100 people injured. Our correspondent Noor Harazin reports now from Gaza.
It's calm here in the Gaza Strip for now, but we can clearly hear the Israeli drones and Israeli warplanes hovering over the Gaza Strip. Citizens do expect that tonight the Israeli warplanes will carry more attacks as a response for the rockets that were fired from the Gaza Strip this morning. Whenever there is a tension, escalation in the West Bank, the people here in the besieged Gaza Strip have different ways to express and to show their support to the people in the West Bank. Palestinian resistance groups here in Gaza usually fire rockets whenever there is tension in the West Bank and Palestinians being killed. Youth and people and citizens participate in rallies and protests. Sometimes they head to the borderline between Gaza and Israel and clash with the Israeli forces. And in other cases, like what happened here today, the people declared the strike. Shops, stores, even universities and schools were closed in the Gaza Strip today in a way for the people of Gaza to show support to the Palestinians in the West Bank after the latest Israeli attack on Nablus. Well, the Israeli forces usually carry out raids in order to arrest Palestinians that they suspect that they belong to Palestinian resistance factions, or that they have weapons that they might use against the Israelis. So this happens in a weekly basis. But however, what happened in Nablus, apparently the tension was really high and Palestinian gunmen clashed with Israeli forces, which resulted in the killing of 10 Palestinians. The same thing, the same scenario happened like a month ago in the Palestinian refugee camp of Jenin, where 9 Palestinians were killed. And this triggered tension between Palestinians and Israelis, where Palestinian individuals started carrying attacks against Israelis. Rockets were fired from Gaza. The Israeli warplanes attacked Gaza. So the last thing that the Palestinian people, especially here in the Gaza Strip, want is to be dragged, or for that tension to repeat itself this time.
3 men have been arrested in Northern Ireland over the attempted murder of an off-duty police officer who was shot while coaching sport at a school. Police say the focus of the investigation is the Irish nationalist militant group, the New IRA. Northern Ireland's political leaders condemned the attack on Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell in a rare joint statement. While a 1998 peace deal largely ended 3 decades of sectarian violence in Northern Ireland, the disputed Northern Ireland Protocol has raised tensions.
The European Commission has banned its staff from using TikTok due to cybersecurity concerns. Staff have been ordered to delete the Chinese-owned video-sharing app on corporate devices and some personal phones. TikTok says it's disappointed by the decision, calling it misguided and based on misconceptions.
An earthquake measuring magnitude 7.2 has hit Tajikistan. The epicenter was 80 kilometers from the border with China and was felt in China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. So far, there have been no reports of casualties.
Millions of people across the United States are bracing for more extreme weather. A winter storm has battered the north and the west of the country with high winds and heavy snow, forcing hundreds of schools to close, grounding flights and cutting power to hundreds of thousands of homes. Meanwhile, there's been unusually warm weather in the south of the country.
A television reporter and a 9-year-old girl have been shot dead in Orlando in Florida, near the scene of a murder that took place just hours earlier. 2 journalists were covering the first shooting when a gunman opened fire. The second reporter and the girl's mother were injured. A man has been detained as a suspect in both attacks.
The Biden administration has unveiled its toughest border policy yet, which could limit thousands of people from seeking asylum in the United States.
The proposed measure means migrants could be turned away if they cross the border illegally or fail to apply for asylum in another country first. Our correspondent Tony Waterman reports.
It's the hardest journey many of these people will ever make, trudging hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles as they seek out a better life in the United States. That journey now set to get a lot more arduous under a new rule proposed by the Biden administration on Tuesday. Starting in May, asylum seekers will need to apply for protection in the countries they transit or use an app to notify Border Control of their asylum plans. If they don't, they will be considered ineligible for asylum in the U.S. and quickly deported. Migrants from Venezuela, Cuba, Haiti, and Nicaragua are already required to use the app. Some say it's a disaster.
Some people have been trying to get an appointment for humanitarian parole since January 12th, and the CBP One app is in chaos. We wake up at 4 a.m. to get the appointment, and the app throws us out. It's a matter of luck.
Pro-migration groups have slammed the proposal, promising to fight it in court. They say the rule creates new barriers and harsh penalties for persecuted people, and that it contradicts Biden's campaign promises to bring humanity back to U.S. migration policy. In a tweet, the America's Immigrant Advocacy Center said Biden's asylum ban is no different to the unlawful transit bans former President Donald Trump tried to impose. The Biden administration refutes this claim, saying it's not a blanket ban and that it opens new legal pathways for migration. But the president is also facing fierce pushback from within his own party. Democratic Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley tweeting that the policy flies in the face of what we should stand for as a nation and urged the president to abandon the rule. It's unlikely the Biden administration will step back from the policy because it's up against a ticking clock. In May, a pandemic policy known as Title 42, which allows border agents to expel migrants, expires. And officials are bracing for a surge in attempted crossings at a time when unlawful migration is already at a record high. The White House has criticized Congress for failing to overhaul the U.S.'s outdated immigration system. And as the blame game continues in Washington, those that need humanitarian protection the most are once again caught in the middle. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Austin, Texas.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, spelling it out why old tech is the key to creating new works of art.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Now, if you're very young, you may not know what a typewriter is. So just imagine a laptop without electricity or the internet. Not much use these days.
But one artist is using old technology to make modern art. CGTN's correspondent Tom Treble has been to meet the man rescuing old typewriters to demonstrate the power of language.
A picture is worth 1,000 words. 26-year-old artist James Cook takes that old adage to a whole new level, with unique artworks created with his collection of vintage typewriters and composed entirely of letters and symbols.
You know, the eyes, they're curved, so it can sometimes be as simple as using the bracket symbols to type the pupils of someone's eye. If I'm doing skin shading or skin tones, I'll use the @ symbol.
Cook loves to collect typewriters. He uses different ones to make different pieces of art. He currently owns 63, many of which have been donated by his fans. He says typing is like playing a musical instrument.
You kind of develop like a muscle memory, so like someone playing the piano, they become quite familiar to like the weighting of the piano keys, and this is quite similar with typewriter art. You know, the placement of the switches, the levers, the movement of the carriage, the weighting of the keys, they're all really critical into making very or incredibly precise drawings.
The London-based artist has created over 250 pieces of artwork, but it's a labor of love. The smallest takes about a week to complete, while bigger pieces can take several months. For his next venture, he wants to find a Chinese typewriter. They look and feel very different to Western ones.
If anyone sees this and also has a machine that they would like to generously donate, then yeah, I'd be more than happy to take one on board and make some typewriter art with Chinese text.
For now, he has his hands full typing a tribute to Big Ben. Thomas Treble, CGTN, London.
The headlines again. The United Nations considers a resolution condemning Russia's aggression in Ukraine and urging a peace deal ahead of the first anniversary of the conflict.
Russia condemns that move by the United Nations after announcing plans to strengthen its nuclear weapons capability.
And Israel carries out airstrikes in the Gaza Strip after Palestinian militants fire rockets at southern Israel.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
There's more on all our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Preview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.